Well, good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue to read The Bishop Who Ate His Boots by Frank Peake. Today we begin Chapter 3. We're going to do Chapter 3 in parts because it's a fairly long chapter, and as much as you may be enjoying it, I'm sure you don't want to sit here for hours on end listening. So let's get to it. Chapter 3, Part A. Missionary Beginnings. Before going further into Isaac Stringer's story, it seems necessary to look briefly at the early missionary situation. The first missionaries to reach the northern parts of the Mackenzie River Valley were the Roman Catholic Oblates of Mary the Immaculate. The Oblates were a missionary order founded in France by Charles J.E. de Masnaud, Bishop of Marseille, in 1816. In 1846, Alexander Antonius Tasch, accompanied by a secular priest who later joined the Oblates, established a mission at Ile-la-Crosse, which is now in Saskatchewan. In the following year, he moved on to work among the Indians in the Lake Athabasca region. Henry Joseph Farrad established the Mission of the Nativity in 1849. Farrad, like his companions, undertook extended missionary journeys, and in 1852 was at Fort Resolution, where he was warmly welcomed by the Indians. The first Roman Catholic missionary to the Eskimos was Peter Henry Gollier. During his brief ministry, he traveled far and wide, establishing missions at Fort Ray, Fort Resolution, Fort Simpson, Fort Norman, Fort Laird, and Fort Good Hope, just within the Arctic Circle. In addition, he visited Fort McPherson, where he had, as he said, the high privilege of bringing about a reconciliation between the Indians and the Eskimos. It was during Gollier's time that the Anglican missions began to advance in the far north. James Hunter, a missionary of some years' experience in Rupert's Land, journeyed to the Mackenzie River Valley in 1858 to assess its possibility as a mission field. He traveled with the Hudson's Bay Company Brigade and went as far as Fort Simpson. He remained in the north for the following winter, making his headquarters at Fort Simpson, but also visiting other forts. During that time, he instructed and baptized 9 Slav Indians and received into the Anglican Communion an agent of the company named Godet, who had been a Roman Catholic. In a report dated November 10, 1892, Bishop Reeve told the Church Missionary Society, CMS, that Fort McPherson on Peel's River had 455 Indians, of whom 410 were adherents to the Church of England and 120 communicants. Recently, in 1890, 2 Roman Catholic priests had been stationed there. This, wrote Bishop Reeve, is our most noteworthy and encouraging mission, where Archdeacon MacDonald had been laboring so long and successfully. Schoolwork was carried on in very difficult circumstances, but there were some 80 pupils whose desire to learn overcame all obstacles. In addition to the Indians, numbers of Eskimos were in the habit of trading at Fort McPherson, and the report indicated Isaac Stringer of Toronto had recently begun a most promising ministry among them. The Americans, continued the bishop, have established a whaling station on Herschel Island and are trading with the Eskimos from there. If that should prove to be a permanent establishment, it might well be the best place for a mission. Here were some of the results of 30 years of missionary labor in the north, in which many shared. The results were not spectacular, but neither were they altogether discouraging. This, then, was the background against which Isaac Stringer's missionary career had now begun. It was with very mixed feelings he watched the departure of the Wrigley, the last link between home and me, he said. After a crowded stay of little more than 48 hours, the vessel carrying the bishop and Tom Marsh moved down the river toward the Great Mackenzie, severing the last tangible contact with the outside world for another 12 months. Now the new missionary had time to take stock of his surroundings. The mission house, where he was to live with the MacDonalds, was a log building containing 4 rooms, with a low attic for storage purposes above them. The largest room in the house was used as a dining room and as the archdeacon's study. In winter it also served as a chapel for the Indian services. Next to it was a smaller room which provided sleeping accommodation for the archdeacon and his family. Of the 2 rooms on either side of the house, one had been used as a storeroom and the other as a kitchen. For a time after Stringer's arrival, he shared the storeroom with the Stores. But as winter approached, he was given exclusive use of the former kitchen. The cooking for the family was done on a stove in the living room. Mrs. MacDonald was a full Indian, but spoke enough English to be understood. She never joined her husband at meals, and rarely accompanied him on his journeys. Their 2 older children, Islay and Kenneth, were away at school in Winnipeg, and a daughter, Anne, was in Orillia, Ontario. The children at home when Stringer arrived were Mary, Neil, and Effie. There was also an adopted Indian boy named Nathaniel. According to Stringer, little Neil ruled his father and sisters and foster brother. Only Mrs. MacDonald could manage him, but the archdeacon would not allow her to spank him. For the first few days, Stringer was busy unpacking his stores and possessions and working to establish himself in his new home. He was also busy studying Eskimo, medicine, and meteorology, and setting up the thermometer and anemometer, which he was to maintain for the Department of Marine and Fisheries. In later years, Mrs. Stringer recalled her husband's early struggle with the Eskimo language. Quote, "He labored slowly to learn Eskimo till he was proficient enough to translate the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, the scripture texts, and 20 hymns." Unquote. It was no easy feat, for the Eskimo had no written language. Isaac wrote each word phonetically into the English alphabet, and then, when he had enough in writing, he began to teach the Eskimos to read. They were amazed and delighted when they discovered they could read sentences. His early days at the post were spent observing and learning. On the day he arrived, he witnessed an Eskimo war dance and described his future charges as, quote-unquote, wild creatures. Later, he watched the archdeacon solemnize an Indian wedding. He observed that the Indians took everything in a stolid and matter-of-fact way. He soon made friends with Joe Hodgson, clerk of the Hudson's Bay Company post, a few yards north of the mission, along the high bank overlooking the river. Another resident of the community, whose company Stringer enjoyed, was the Count de Samville, who had arrived 3 years earlier to undertake surveying and mapping. During the summer, life might have continued in fairly leisurely fashion if the need for an Eskimo mission had not weighed heavily upon the missionaries. Stringer gave what assistance he could to the archdeacon with the Indian mission, and set about learning the Eskimo language. But Fort McPherson was predominantly an Indian mission, and he had come to work among the Eskimos. It was now 20 years since the Eskimo mission had first been proposed, and it seemed that the sooner he went among them, the better it would be. Moreover, there was the ever-present threat of competition from the black-robed oblates, who, it was felt, would lose no opportunity to steal a march on the hated Protestants and claim the Eskimos as their own. All these factors were taken into consideration at a council of war held before the Wrigley's departure. Stringer took part in the deliberations with Bishop Reeve and Archdeacon MacDonald, and it had been decided he should go at once to the mouth of the Mackenzie to meet the Eskimos in their summer quarters. So 10 days after his arrival at Fort McPherson, Stringer set out on his first expedition. He traveled in a canoe accompanied by Jimmy Barber, an Indian, and Kenneth Stewart, a half-breed. Leaving at the same time were Hodgson and de Senville, and they had an Indian, George Greenland, and an Eskimo with them. Stringer was keenly interested in all that he saw and viewed his surroundings with the practiced eye of a countryman. He reported seeing asters, a sort of pea, vetches, besides other flowers and birds. Like other visitors to the Arctic, he was amazed by the brilliant colors of the flowers and vegetation. One day he shot a gull, and the next he saw moose tracks. So the voyage continued, sometimes paddling, sometimes drifting, stopping periodically for meals, and at night camping where the opportunity offered. As they went further north, he noticed that the trees grew fewer and smaller, although they never completely disappeared in the Mackenzie Valley. After 10 days, the two parties reached Point Separation, a desolate spot which marked the beginning of the Mackenzie Delta. Here, Stringer made arrangements for Kenneth Stewart and George Greenland to change places. Greenland would then be able to serve him as an interpreter. All were happy with the exchange, and Hodgson and de Sanville headed into the main channel to continue their explorations. Stringer, with Jimmy Barber and George Greenland, traveled to the Eskimo village of Kittigazut. His companions were well known to the Eskimos, and as they approached the village, a boy in a kayak came with an invitation to go to the camp of a prominent Eskimo named Tuwakchik. However, on learning a Roman priest was already there, Stringer decided it would be better to pitch his tent on the sands in another part of the village. The village consisted of a row of canvas or leather tents along the water's edge. When the visitors arrived in mid-afternoon, the men were out at sea hunting whales, but the missionary was greeted by the women, and he shook hands with all of them. The men returned in the evening and had caught many whales, which averaged from 8 to 15 feet in length. For a time, all the Eskimos were busy cutting up the whales, storing the fat or blubber in bags, and hanging up the meat in thin slices to dry. When this was done, they wandered casually to the missionary's tent with childlike curiosity. They wanted to know more about him, to find out why he had come, and also asked for a drink of tea. After due consideration, Stringer boiled 2 kettles full of tea and served them. In the meantime, he spoke to them, telling them of the greater present I was going to give them, the gospel. They seemed pleased. One said if this were true, they had better listen, and all promised to come again tomorrow. But with this response there was also a challenge. Quote, "If the visitor attached such importance to this religion," they asked, "why had he delayed so long in coming to them? As one old man remarked, 'It is the white people's fault that we did not know about the Christian faith before. We have seen them a long time now, and they have never taught us.'" In the next few days, Stringer and his interpreter, George Greenland, went from tent to tent, explaining their mission and telling the Eskimos as simply as they could about God and what he had done in sending his son. Generally, the Eskimos listened attentively and seemed glad to hear him, but he wondered if their attention was entirely disinterested because he found them continually begging for tea, tobacco, or other items. If these gifts were not forthcoming, they would act as though insulted. Nor was the situation improved by the fact that they reported the Roman Catholic priest to have been generous in his gifts. In order to secure more privacy, the missionary hoisted a small Union Jack outside his tent and explained that he did not wish to receive visitors from the time when it was taken down at night until it was raised again in the morning. After a few days, the initial curiosity waned, and the Eskimos continued about their business. The first Sunday of his visit was like any other day. The men went out to hunt whales. The women were busy mending clothes and attending to other domestic chores. The missionary wandered restlessly from place to place, finding opportunity from time to time to speak a word to the women and children. In the evening, when the men returned, he spoke to them round the campfire. After 10 days at Kittigazut, Stringer and his helpers set off for the return journey. He had gained some experience and insight into his new work. He had already learned what many missionaries to the Indians and Eskimos never seemed to have grasped, for he wrote in his diary, "It seems to me that it is not their fault that they are not better. I cannot say that the souls of those who are lying dead up the hill behind our camp are in hell. I shall speak to them in future more about God's love than his wrath." But there were many questions. What of the future? What could he hope to achieve? Could he become sufficiently proficient in the Eskimo tongue? Would the Eskimos receive his message? What of the oblate priest, who had apparently been liberal with his gifts? where Stringer had thought it wise to refuse. To his diary he confided, quote, "Not knowing the language, it is a little uninteresting. I try to break this discouraging feeling, but there is no earthly way. I long for someone to confide in, someone to whom I could talk and tell of the difficulties. One word of cheer, I know, would give encouragement. There is no one but Jesus. Tell it to Jesus. He is a friend well known. You have no other, such a friend or brother. Tell it to Jesus alone." That settles it. Goodbye doubts. Goodbye discouragements. And we'll stop there for this week. And next week we'll continue with part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.